It is a Tuesday afternoon in Jerusalem, and the most important conversation in human history is about to begin on a hillside. But first, a man is walking out of a building.
He is not running, he is not shouting. He walks out of the temple the way you walk out of a room you will never enter again, with the quiet finality of someone who has already made a decision that the rest of the world has not caught up to yet. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. The year is approximately AD 30, and the building he is leaving is not just a building. It is the center of the universe for every Jewish person alive, the house where heaven and earth were believed to touch,
Where the glory of God lived between the cherubim, where 1,000 years of sacrifice and prayer and covenant had accumulated like sediment into something almost too heavy to look at directly. And he walks out of it, calmly, for the last time. His disciples catch up to him the way tourists always do, pointing. "Look, teacher, what massive stones! What magnificent buildings!" You can hear the pride in their voices. These were Galilean fishermen and tax collectors standing in the shadow of one of the most extraordinary structures in the ancient world. Herod's temple complex covered 35 acres. Some of its foundation stones weighed over 1,000,000 pounds. The white marble caught the morning sun so sharply that travelers said looking at it from a distance was like looking at a mountain of snow. And Jesus does not even slow down. "Do you see all these things?" he says. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." That is not a metaphor. That is not poetry. That is a specific, falsifiable prediction about a specific building made of specific stones, and it lands on the disciples like a stone itself. Later that evening, 4 of them, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, pull Jesus aside on the Mount of Olives. The temple is visible across the valley, golden in the fading light. And they ask him 2 questions that have been argued about ever since. When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming? What follows is Matthew 24, the most debated chapter in the New Testament, the most misread passage in the history of the church. This is not a prophecy chart. This is not a newspaper headline decoder. This is not a message about a distant future that has nothing to do with the people sitting on that hillside. This is something far more specific and far more astonishing. And there is one phrase in this chapter, 4 words in Greek, that unlocks the entire thing. We will get there. To understand what Jesus is doing in Matthew 24, you have to understand what the disciples actually asked him. They used a specific Greek word, parousia, and that word is doing enormous work in this conversation. Work that gets lost the moment you translate it as simply coming. In the 1st century, parousia was not a religious word. It was a political one. When a Roman emperor or a conquering general arrived at a city, that arrival was called his parousia, his royal presence, his official coming. Cities would send delegations out to meet him on the road. They would line the streets. They would declare his parousia as the beginning of a new era. So when the disciples ask about the sign of Jesus' parousia, they are not asking about a physical descent from outer space. They are asking about his arrival as king, the moment when his authority becomes undeniable, when the world has to reckon with who he is. They want to know, when will everyone see what we already believe? Jesus answers them, in detail. But his answer reaches back much further than that Tuesday evening on the Mount of Olives. Stay with me. 1,400 years before Jesus walks out of the temple, a man named Moses stands on the plains of Moab and delivers the longest sermon in the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy. And in chapter 28, Moses does something extraordinary. He tells the people of Israel exactly what will happen to them if they break their covenant with God. Not in vague spiritual terms, in specific, almost unbearable detail. A nation from far away, Moses says, from the ends of the earth, will swoop down on you like an eagle. He describes a siege. He describes starvation so severe that mothers will eat their own children. He describes the finest cities reduced to rubble. He describes exile and scattering. And here is what most people miss. Rome's legions marched under eagle standards. The Roman eagle was their military symbol, stamped on every banner, carried into every battle. When Titus and his armies surrounded Jerusalem in AD 70, they came from the ends of the Mediterranean world, and they came under the eagle. Moses wrote that in 1400 BC. The disciples, sitting with Jesus on the Mount of Olives, knew Deuteronomy 28 by heart. Every Jewish child did. And what Jesus is doing in Matthew 24 is not inventing a new prophecy. He is standing at the end of a 1400-year-old warning and saying, "It is almost time." But Moses was not the only one who saw this coming. 600 years before Jesus, a priest named Ezekiel sat by the Chebar River in Babylon, exiled, displaced, far from home. And he received one of the strangest visions in all of Scripture. In Ezekiel chapter 10, he watches the glory of God, the Shekinah, the manifest presence of God that had dwelt in the temple between the cherubim. He watches it rise. Slowly, reluctantly almost. It lifts from between the cherubim. It pauses at the threshold of the temple. It moves to the east gate. And then it departs. It leaves. And within years, Babylon arrives. The city falls. The temple burns. Every stone is thrown down. The pattern is not subtle. When God's presence leaves the temple does not long survive. Now come back to that Tuesday afternoon in AD 30. Jesus has just spent the final days of his public ministry in Jerusalem. In Matthew 23, the chapter immediately before the discourse on the Mount of Olives, he delivers 7 devastating pronouncements against the religious leaders. And then he says this, "Look, your house is left to you desolate." Your house, not my Father's house, not the house of God, your house. In Jewish theology, that phrase, that single shift in pronoun, is the sound of the Shekinah departing. Jesus is doing what Ezekiel watched the glory of God do 6 centuries earlier. He is leaving. And when he walks out of the temple complex in the very next verse, at the opening of Matthew 24, it is not a dramatic gesture. It is a theological statement. God has left the building. The disciples point at the stones because they cannot yet feel what has just happened. They are still dazzled by the architecture. But Jesus knows that an empty temple, however magnificent its stones, is just a building. And buildings fall. Here is what's remarkable. The disciples ask 2 questions. When will the temple fall? And what will be the sign of your parousia? To them, these feel like 2 separate questions. To Jesus, they are the same question. The fall of the temple and his vindication as king are not 2 different events separated by centuries. They are the same event, seen from 2 different angles. That is the key that unlocks Matthew 24. And it is hiding in plain sight, in a single verse that most people read right past. So here is the pattern. It has happened before. Twice, in fact, before Jesus ever sits down on the Mount of Olives. The first time, Israel breaks covenant. The prophets warn them. The glory of God departs the temple. A foreign empire arrives. The temple falls. The people are scattered. That is Babylon. That is 586 BC. That is Ezekiel watching the Shekinah lift off the mercy seat and drift eastward like smoke. The second time, Israel breaks covenant again. The prophets warn them again. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, 4 centuries of silence, and then John the Baptist standing in the Jordan River. The glory of God arrives in human form and walks into the temple and teaches there and heals there, and then is rejected there, and then walks out and says, "Your house is left to you desolate," and a foreign empire arrives. You are watching the same sequence run for the second time, with higher stakes and a different ending. But here is what changes everything. Every other prophet who warned Israel stood outside the temple and called from a distance. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they were messengers. They carried words that came from somewhere else. They pointed beyond themselves to the God whose patience was running out. Jesus does not point beyond himself. When Jesus walks out of the temple, he is not a messenger departing. He is the message departing. He is not the finger pointing at the moon. He is the moon. And the disciples, sitting on the hillside with the temple gleaming across the valley, are about to hear him say things that no prophet has ever had the authority to say. Pay attention to this. Because in Matthew 24, Jesus quotes Daniel, not casually, deliberately. He reaches into Daniel chapter 9, the prophecy about the prince who destroys the city and the sanctuary. He reaches into Daniel chapter 7, the vision of the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And he does not quote these passages the way a rabbi quotes a text. He quotes them the way a man quotes his own biography. He is telling his disciples, Daniel was writing about me, and you are about to watch it happen. This is the moment Matthew 24 stops being a confusing end times puzzle and starts being the most coherent chapter in the New Testament. Jesus is not throwing prophecy at a wall. He is closing a loop that opened in the book of Daniel 500 years earlier, and he knows exactly what he is doing. Before we get there, and we are getting there, I promise, I want to ask you something. Here is a question I want you to answer in the comments with a 1 or a 2. When you think about Matthew 24, when you read it, when you hear it preached, do you understand it as a prophecy about the future that still has not happened yet? Type 1. Or do you read it as something Jesus said that was fulfilled within his own generation, within 40 years of that Tuesday afternoon? Type 2. Drop your answer below. I read every single comment, and your answer is going to matter more by the end of this video than it does right now. Because in the next few minutes, we are going to look at 4 words in Greek. 4 words that Jesus spoke on that hillside. 4 words that the church has been wrestling with for 2,000 years. And when you finally hear what those 4 words actually mean, what they meant to every Jewish ear in the first century, Matthew 24 is never going to look the same again. 500 years before Jesus sits down on the Mount of Olives, a young Jewish man named Daniel is living in exile in Babylon. He is a captive. His city is rubble. His temple is ash. And in the middle of all of that loss, God gives him a vision so strange, so layered, so compressed with meaning, that scholars are still unpacking it today. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel sees thrones being set up. He sees the Ancient of Days, God himself, take his seat. He sees the court convene, the books open. And then he sees something that stops him cold. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. Read that again slowly. The Son of Man in Daniel's vision is not coming down to earth. He is going up to the Ancient of Days, up to the throne room, up to receive a kingdom. The clouds in Daniel 7 are not the floor he lands on. They are the vehicle he rides to his coronation. This is throne room language, vindication language, the language of a king being recognized after a period of suffering and rejection. And Jesus quotes it directly. In Matthew 24, verse 30, "They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." He is not describing a man descending through the atmosphere. He is describing Daniel's vision, the Son of Man going up to receive what is his. And the sign that this has happened, the visible proof that the coronation is real, is the fall of Jerusalem. When the temple falls, Jesus is saying, that is when you will know. That is when the clouds part and the reality becomes undeniable. I told you it would happen. It happened. Which means everything else I told you is true. But it gets stranger. Because Daniel does not only give Jesus the image of the Son of Man on the clouds, he gives Jesus the timeline. Daniel chapter 9 contains one of the most precise prophetic sequences in all of Scripture. The 70 weeks, the anointed one who is cut off, and then this. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. A prince, his people, the city, the sanctuary, destroyed. Jesus reads Daniel and knows what is coming. He knows who the prince is. He knows what his people, the Romans, will do to this city. And he knows when. Which brings us to the 4 words. Matthew 24, verse 34. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Genea ot ume. This generation will not. The Greek word is genea. And in Matthew's Gospel, not in a theology textbook, not in a Greek lexicon pulled out of context, but in Matthew's Gospel specifically, Jesus uses this word 11 times. 11 times, and every single time, without exception, it refers to the people standing in front of him. The living generation, the men and women of his own time. In Matthew 11, he says this generation is like children in the marketplace. He is talking about the crowds who rejected John the Baptist. In Matthew 12, he says this generation will be condemned by the Queen of the South. He is talking to the Pharisees in front of him. In Matthew 23, he says, all this will come upon this generation, and the context is unmistakable. He is looking at the scribes and Pharisees of first-century Jerusalem. Genea never means race in Matthew. It never means a future generation somewhere down the line. It means the people standing in front of Jesus when he says it. And here is what that means. Jesus is not giving his disciples a prophecy about the 21st century. He is giving them a 40-year warning. He is saying, within your lifetime, before the youngest person sitting on this hillside has gray hair, you will see everything I am describing. The armies surrounding Jerusalem, the abominations standing in the holy place, the tribulations so severe that nothing in history compares to it, the temple thrown down stone by stone. And then he says something that sounds like an escape clause. But about that day and hour, no one knows. People have used that verse to say Jesus was uncertain, that he hedged his prediction. But read it again. He is not saying he does not know whether it will happen. He has just told them with total confidence that it will happen within their generation. He is saying that the precise date, the day, the hour, is not theirs to know. The certainty is not in question, only the calendar, now. The Roman general Titus surrounds Jerusalem in April of AD 70. The siege lasts 5 months. By August, the temple is burning. Josephus, a Jewish historian who was there, who watched it happen, who interviewed survivors, records that 1,100,000 people died. He records that the Romans dismantled the temple stone by stone. He records that soldiers pried the stones apart to recover the gold that had melted in the fire and run down into the cracks. Not one stone left on another. Josephus was not a Christian. He had no theological reason to confirm Jesus' prediction. He was a Jewish commander who had surrendered to Rome and spent the rest of his life writing history. And his account of the fall of Jerusalem reads like a commentary on Matthew 24. Here is the part nobody tells you. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century, records something extraordinary. Before the Roman siege began, before the armies of Titus surrounded the city, the Christians in Jerusalem left. They packed their things and crossed the Jordan River to a city called Pella in the Decapolis. They fled to the mountains, just as Jesus had told them. They did not go back for their cloaks. They did not wait to see if things would improve. They trusted 4 words spoken on a hillside 40 years earlier. And not one of them died in the siege. You have probably been handed Matthew 24 as a prophecy checklist, a chart you hold up against today's headlines to see if we are getting close to the end. But Jesus never gave his disciples a checklist. He gave them a survival guide, specific, time-stamped, geographically precise. Flee to the mountains. Pray it does not happen in winter. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. These are not symbols. These are evacuation instructions for a specific group of people, in a specific city, in a specific window of time. And they worked. So here is the question that Matthew 24 leaves you with. Not a question about prophecy charts or end times timelines, but a question about a person. What kind of man does this? What kind of man looks at the most fortified city in the Roman Empire, the city protected by 3 walls and a garrison of soldiers, and the psychological armor of 1,000 years of divine promise, and says calmly while walking away from it, "Not one stone will be left on another"? What kind of man quotes Daniel about himself, predicts the arrival of a specific empire, gives his followers a 40-year warning with specific geographic instructions, and gets every single detail right? There is only one answer to that question, and Matthew 24 is not trying to hide it. There is a detail in the story of the Pella Christians that does not get nearly enough attention. Eusebius tells us they left because of an oracle, a word, a warning, a prophecy. Scholars widely understand that oracle to be the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. But think about what that actually means in practice. These are not people who read Matthew 24 in a leather-bound Bible with cross-references and a concordance. These are people living in Jerusalem in the late AD 60s, watching the political situation deteriorate around them, watching the zealots take control of the city, watching Rome assemble its legions on the horizon. And they have in their memory the words of a teacher who was crucified 30 years ago. And those words said, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, do not go into the city. Get out, flee to the mountains, do not look back." Their neighbors thought they were abandoning their people. Their neighbors thought they were cowards or traitors or simply wrong. The city was defended, the walls were strong. God would not let his temple fall, not again, not after Babylon. Surely this time it would be different. It was not different. The Pella Christians staked their lives, literally their physical survival, not on a theological position, but on a word. The words of Matthew 24 were not for them a topic for commentary or debate. They were an address, a date, a direction. Flee, now, before it is too late. And here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. Faith in the first century looked like this: a community of people reading specific words, in a specific situation, making a specific decision based entirely on whether those words were true. Not whether they felt inspiring, not whether they were comforting in a general sense, whether they were true. Whether the man who spoke them actually knew what he was talking about. They decided he did. They left. They survived. This is what the Shekinah departure in Matthew 23 ultimately points toward, not just judgment, but rescue. When God's presence departed the temple in Ezekiel 10, the city fell and the people were taken to Babylon. That was a story with no resurrection. The people survived, but the glory did not return for 70 years. But in Matthew 24, the Shekinah departure is followed by something Ezekiel never saw coming. The one who walks out of the temple does not go into exile. He goes to a garden, and then to a cross, and then to a tomb. And 3 days later, he walks out of that too. The stones of the temple are scattered. But the one the temple was always pointing toward is not scattered. He is not buried under rubble. He is not a casualty of the Roman siege. He is the reason the siege happened, because the covenant had reached its terminus. The old had to give way. The temple made of stone had to fall, so that the temple made of living stones could rise. And that is where Matthew 24 stops being a chapter about destruction and becomes a chapter about what is left standing when everything else has fallen. So let me leave you with 3 things. The first, Matthew 24 is not about your generation. It is about Jesus' generation. And Jesus said so, in plain Greek, with a word he used the same way every single time in this gospel. Genea. This generation. The people standing on that hillside. The temple fell in AD 70, 40 years after Jesus spoke those words, exactly as he said it would. That is not a problem for your faith. That is the foundation of it. A prediction that specific, fulfilled that precisely, by a Galilean carpenter with no political power and no army. That is not luck. That is not coincidence. That is the voice of someone who knows how history ends because he is the one writing it. The second, the cosmic language in Matthew 24. The sun darkened, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from the sky, is not a description of literal astronomy. It is the prophetic vocabulary of covenant judgment. Isaiah used it for Babylon. Ezekiel used it for Egypt. Amos used it for Israel. It means a world is ending, not the planet, but a world, a system, an age. The age of the Mosaic covenant, the age of the Levitical priesthood, the age when God's presence on earth was mediated through a building made of stone. That age ended in AD 70, and once you learn to read that language, the whole Old Testament opens up like a room you have been walking past your entire life without knowing the door was there. The third, and this is the one I want you to carry with you. Jesus was right. Not approximately right, not right in a general spiritual sense, completely, specifically, historically, verifiably right. He said the temple would fall, it fell. He said it would happen within a generation, it happened within 40 years. He said his followers should flee to the mountains, they fled, and they survived. He said not one stone would be left on another, and Josephus records that Roman soldiers pried the stones apart with their hands to recover the melted gold. Every evacuation instruction followed, every stone thrown down, every word confirmed. And then he said this, right there in Matthew 24, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. If he was right about everything else, if a first-century teacher from a town nobody had heard of looked at the most powerful empire in the ancient world and called the shot, detail by detail, and did not miss once, then when he says his words will outlast the universe itself, you can take that to the bank. If this video changed the way you read Matthew 24, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me what shifted for you, or tell me what questions you still have, because there is more in this chapter than any one video can hold. If someone you know has been confused or troubled by Matthew 24, share this with them. They deserve to know that Jesus was not guessing. Like this video if it helped, and subscribe, because we are going deeper into the Bible every week, and there is so much more to see. The temple is gone. The stones are scattered, but the words are still here. Every one of them.